Today, we are cracking open a fascinating legal puzzle, one that comes straight from the pages of the Talmud. Now, on the surface, it looks like it's all about a batch of misplaced figs, but what it really uncovers is this profound principle about what gives something, well, value.
To really get this, let's put it in modern terms. Imagine you're in the kitchen, right? You're making a massive batch of cookie dough, and you suddenly realize one bad egg somehow got mixed in. Is the whole batch ruined, or does that one little bit of bad just, disappear into all the good stuff? That's the exact problem we're going to explore, just with a bit of an ancient twist.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about this idea of nullification. Then we'll get into what makes something so special it can't be nullified. After that, we dive headfirst into our main story, the case of the lost figs and the brilliant debate it caused. Then we'll see how that same logic gets applied to something completely different, like animals. And finally, we'll zoom out and look at the deep meaning behind it all. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the nullification problem. This gets right to the heart of our whole cookie dough dilemma.
In Jewish law, there's a really practical rule for when things get accidentally mixed up. If a tiny bit of something you're not supposed to eat falls into a giant batch of stuff that's totally fine, it's usually considered nullified. It just gets absorbed. It's a common sense solution, right? But that little word usually is where it all gets interesting, because that hints at some really important exceptions.
So let's talk about that exception. Section 2. What makes something count? This is actually the key that unlocks the entire puzzle. First off, let's just make sure we're on the same page with our terms. Nullification, that's the principle we were just talking about. It's the bad egg disappears in the dough rule, where a tiny prohibited thing gets legally swallowed up by the okay majority. But then you have this incredible counter concept, a counted item. In Hebrew, it's a davar shebinyan. And this is not just any old ingredient. This is something with significance, something distinct. Think about stuff you buy one by one, not by the pound, like a perfect apple or a specific animal. The simple act of counting it, of treating it as an individual, gives it a whole special legal status. And this brings us to the fundamental rule of the game, right from our source. The Talmud puts it as plainly as possible: any item that is counted cannot be nullified. Basically, its importance protects it. It can't just vanish into the crowd, no matter how big that crowd is. So, with those two big ideas in our back pocket, nullification and counter items, we're ready for the main event, Section 3, the case of the lost figs. This is where the abstract theory crashes into a very real and very sticky situation. Okay, so here's the scenario. Picture a worker who's making these dried fig cakes. They've got one measure of figs that are prohibited because they haven't been tithed. This prohibited batch gets pressed onto the opening of one big container. The catch is, it's just one container in a whole storeroom of identical containers, all filled with perfectly good, permitted figs. And then, the worker forgets which one it was. Whoops! And here is the million-dollar question, or maybe the million-fig question. What on earth do you do now? Do you have to assume the tops of all the containers are now contaminated? Or can you just say, hey, it's one small bad batch in a sea of good ones, so nullification kicks in and we can basically ignore it? This is the exact puzzle the sages had to unravel. This question, as you can imagine, led to an absolutely fantastic intellectual showdown, which brings us to Section 4, a rabbinic debate. The two heavyweights who stepped into the ring on this one were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And their disagreement, you'll see, isn't just about figs. It's about the very nature of significance and how we decide what counts. So let's break down their positions. On one side, you've got Rabbi Eliezer. He takes a pretty practical, mathematical approach. He says, look, if the ratio of good to bad is big enough, he suggests 100 to 1, then yeah, nullification works. The problem just gets washed away by the numbers. But Rabbi Yehoshua comes back with a much harder line. He says, absolutely not. These fig cakes are important. They're counted items. And because of that, they can never be nullified, no matter how many good ones there are. And he really drives the point home with this incredible statement. He says, even if there are 300 permitted containers, it is not nullified. For Rabbi Yehoshua, the significance of that one item is absolute. You can't just dilute it with numbers. Its identity, its special status, persists. It is, in a legal sense, indestructible.
Now, you might be wondering, why get so worked up about figs? Well, it's because this logic doesn't just stay in the pantry, which leads us to section 5, from figs to animals. It turns out the whole reason the Talmud brings up this fig debate in the first place is to help solve an even bigger problem. What happens when one animal that's disqualified from being a sacrifice gets lost in a huge flock of perfectly fine animals? And the logic just clicks right into place. The sages take Rabbi Yeshua's super strict ruling from the fig case and apply it here. An animal, they argue, is the ultimate counted item. It has individuality, it's significant. So just like that fig cake, it can't be nullified by the flock. Now, there is an interesting alternative theory from Rav Ashi who suggests that maybe living creatures are just inherently important, full stop. But the main line of reasoning leans directly on the powerful precedent set by our lost figs. And that brings us to our final section, where we can finally zoom out and ask, what does this all really mean? Section 6, counting and value. So what's the bottom line? An item gets nullified when it becomes totally indistinct, completely lost in the mix. And interestingly, the source text says that if the bad figs had been crumbled up inside one of the containers so you didn't know where they were, then they would be nullified. Why? Because they've lost their distinct identity. But an item is not nullified when it's treated as a distinct unit, as an important, counted item. And this, right here, is the really profound takeaway. It's not just about what something is made of, it's about how we treat it. The simple act of counting something, of singling it out as an individual, gives it a special status, a significance that can't just be erased. Once something is counted, it has an identity. It stands on its own. It can no longer just be ignored or absorbed by the crowd. Its individuality gives it a real power, both legally and, I think, conceptually. And that leaves us with a final thought, something that goes way beyond ancient law. When does a simple act of counting something, whether it's a person, a vote, or an idea, give it a value that's so much bigger than its physical substance? What are the counted items in our world today?